you've got a lot going on. You always do. And I'm really tickled to death that you have written Unmasked Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy. And I would like to start talking about that to begin with, because I don't want to run out of any kind of time. Tell me about this book and why you wrote it, what your inspiration was, and let's just start talking about that.
Dr. Phil, you wrote a book recently about the tyranny of the fringe, and there are many fringes, political extremes that exist domestically in the United States. Unfortunately, some of these movements organize into violent extremism, and my book, Unmasked, focused on one particular movement that has wreaked a lot of violence and misery and injuries on the American public. That movement, it calls itself Antifa. They claim to be anti-fascist, but that label is a misnomer. Their tactics use violence and intimidations, killings if need be, property destruction, vandalism, with the goal of silencing their opponents by any means necessary. Now, they claim that their opponents are fascists, but they go after journalists, they go after regular conservatives, they go after women who speak up about women's rights. Anybody who they politically disagree with is labeled a fascist and is therefore subject to be targets of violence and injury and worse.
So, who are these people?
It's a movement of people who organize under an ideology of anarchism and communism. One of the tactics that they use is called black bloc, and that's where they dress head to toe in black, cover their faces with black masks, and gather for ostensibly a public demonstration that almost always devolves into either brawling with people that they want to fight and to injure, and setting buildings on fire, attacking police stations, injuring police officers. In 2020, after George Floyd died, that was their propaganda moment to really embed themselves into larger protest movements in the United States. And they were able to agitate for riots that happened in Minneapolis, in Portland, in Seattle, and so on and so on from coast to coast. The people who are involved are typically young people. Looking at Portland, Oregon, where I'm from and where I did my reporting at the time, that there were about 1,000 people who were arrested over months and months of nightly riots, really violent riots, might I add. And the demographic that I can pull out based on the arrest data is these are young adults, typically in age from 18 to mid-30s. There's a split representation of male and female. Most of them are white. They claim to be protesting for Black Lives Matter. Often the businesses that they target are businesses owned by Black families and immigrant families. So their whole movement is based around deception, from the name to what they say they fight for. And I think part of the reason in the success that they've had on a propaganda level in the mainstream media and legacy media, because if you look at the legacy media reporting, either through broadcast television or newspapers, these people are described as racial justice protesters or anti-racist protesters or even social justice protesters. And that really is giving into the deception that is part of their propaganda. So my book seeks to unmask their activities, their ideologies, their origins, and how dangerous they actually are. And in addition to my writings, I was on the ground for many, many years in Portland, Oregon, which is really the epicenter of their organizing. And I went out, recorded with just my mobile phone or GoPro, because I wanted the public to see for their own eyes what the videos and photos capture. It's one thing if you don't believe my interpretation of events,
Right.
that's fine. You don't have to follow my writings, but watch the videos.
And what are the consistent things you've caught on video? Obviously, these people get violent. Do they actually spawn the confrontations, and how do they do that?
So where they are most effective is if they can embed themselves into a larger movement, because the number of people who are willing to engage in violent confrontations and violent criminalities and starting fires is relatively small. But you only need a small number of people to actually be quite devastating and damaging, or to even lead a revolution, which is their ultimate goal, by the way. They would like to topple the United States. So going back 4 years, during the protests that erupted across the United States after George Floyd's death, there were a lot of decent people who showed up because they really thought that they were protesting against police brutality, against racism in police departments, et cetera, et cetera. And within this sentiment of police hatred or police dislike, these agitators came in and did things like, for example, breaking a window on a building or starting a fire on the street. I've talked to law enforcement sources, and they say that those type of actions act as it shifts the dynamic in the crowd. When it's at night and fires start, it's much easier for that protest group to devolve into a riot. And breaking a window then creates it's like blood in the water when you also have criminals and other bad faith actors showing up to these protests who are hoping to loot. And that's what we saw happen over and over in cities. A business would get broken into, dozens of people would swarm in and loot it, and then the next business, police are overwhelmed, police are demoralized, police are defunded. So it's the danger of Antifa is that they create an environment where political violence is normalized under causes that sound quite noble. And so the violence happens in front of us, in front of the American public, and people don't recognize it because misreporting in the media, journalists like myself who are out there with videos and photos are beaten and robbed. In 2019, in downtown Portland, I was severely beaten by a group of mass Antifa members, all in black. They surrounded me, they robbed me of my equipment, they punched me repeatedly in the face and the head, to the point where I was hospitalized with a subarachnoid brain hemorrhage, which is bleeding on the brain, and I nearly died from that. And they repeated violence against me again in 2021. Unfortunately, there are very, very few journalists in the United States who are devoted to this beat of covering Antifa. Because if you do, you're subjected to threats, to violence. People can show up at your house. So it's a very dangerous subject that I cover, but I do it because people don't realize how dangerous this movement is. They can be so destabilizing without actually changing any of the laws. For example, like in Portland, we still have the First Amendment in Portland, Oregon. But if you create an environment where, let's say, Christians who are holding a worship event in public, Republican voters who are holding a rally, or women who are protesting for women's rights because of transgender ideology, and these are all examples that have happened in Portland, these rallies would be subjected to violence from Antifa and police don't respond. So it creates a culture where people then eventually silence themselves, because if you organize in public, if you engage in your First Amendment rights, you could be subjected to mob violence and police will do nothing. Nobody will get arrested because nobody can be identified. I've been a victim of Antifa's violence repeatedly over the years, and unfortunately, nobody's been arrested, much less prosecuted and convicted for any of these mob beatings.